As you know, Bases Loaded is a classic baseball game. The first Bases Loaded is remembered as a great classic to this day, and there are still people out there who still play this. And to be honest, it really is a lot of fun. But the thing is, what you probably don't know about Bases Loaded is that the North American version, the NES version, is actually a major disappointment. Now, it's a great game, it's a lot of fun, I love playing it, but if you compare it to the original Japanese version, you'll be shocked at how much better that one is. The NES version features muffled audio, and it's a worse experience overall. The crazy part is that this is all Nintendo's fault. Alright, here it is in all of its glory, Moero Pro Yaku, the Japanese version of Bases Loaded, and I'm just going to call it Bases Loaded from now on. This game was released in late June 1987, and it was a major hit in Japan. Now, what you have to understand is that Japan was still in the middle of Famista Mania in June 1987, and I'm not kidding when I say mania. Famista had the undisputed #1 slot on the charts in Biweekly Famitsu, and had been on the top of the Famicom market for basically 7 months. Famista is really the game that changed everything. In fact, I explained that in an earlier video that you might have missed. Now, if you want to make sure you don't miss any of my videos, please consider becoming a channel member. So as you know, sometimes YouTube does a bad job of telling people about new videos, like the one I made on Famista or RBI Baseball about 3 weeks ago. For only $4 a month, you can become a channel member and get access to videos as soon as they're ready, usually about a week before they're released. That way you can watch all of the classics before they become classics and before anybody else watches them. Or, you know, if you want to support me through other means, I've also got a Patreon where paying members get access to over 8 terabytes worth of old sports broadcasts. I've also got the Baseball Replay Journal blog that you can also become a member of for other benefits. Anyway, like I said, Famista was really the major game changer, but it wasn't a perfect game. There were people who wanted something that was a little bit more realistic, that looked more like baseball on TV. That is where Jalico came along. I mean, if you've ever played Famista, you know that it's nothing like watching a game of baseball on TV, right? Even in Japan, baseball on television was dominated by the famous center field camera shot. Even the high school baseball tournaments were like this. It was always the center field angle on television. So it's obvious why Jalico wanted to use that famous center field camera angle, right? Even though it did make the control of the game a little bit awkward. But what might not be so obvious to you is the lengths to which they made Bases Loaded feel like an actual television broadcast of a baseball game. You had things like the name of the player on the scoreboard. And there was the player walking up to the plate. Most important of all, though, were the sounds. Bases Loaded featured incredibly impressive, high-quality sounds. But the North American version just does not have those sounds. Now, it's similar, but it's not quite the same. I mean, you can hear the umpire's voice, sure, but everything is muffled. It seriously just feels like something is missing. Now, this might not seem like a huge difference at first, but if you actually sit down and play the games, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Bases Loaded on the NES is a perfectly fine game, sure, but the Famicom version was infamous for its amazing sounds. We're talking about the NES here, right? This wasn't exactly like the most impressive piece of computer hardware that was available at the time, and yet the game could play sounds that sounded better than those old Sound Blaster PC games that were made 5 years after this one came out. Most impressive is the way that the crowd reacts to balls hit in the air. And if you really get hold of one, you'll never forget it. The sound effects really turned this game into something special. And you don't have to just take my word for it, right? The reviews of Bases Loaded in Japan were filled with praise for the audio. If you look at Biweekly Famitsu's special on Bases Loaded in June 1987, you'll see it right away. The focus right here is on the voice synthesizer, which really was the game's killer app. The same is true of the original advertisement for Bases Loaded. These text boxes all represent voices directly from the game. And of course, Biweekly Famitsu gave the game excellent ratings, noting how realistic the overall presentation was, including both the television camera angles and the amazing voice synthesis. Now, I'm going to explain to you exactly how this works, including why this didn't work for the NES version, and the truth is kind of surprising, and it's also kind of simple to understand. Alright, so we'll start off with this baby. This is the insides of the Famicom. After we turn it around so you can read it, you'll notice that there are two big chips in the middle. This one down here is the CPU. This is the thing that reads instructions to the computer unit. And this thing right above it is the PPU, or the picture processing unit. This is where the sprites are processed. So the NES is pretty cool because it has a separate PPU, right? That's the graphics processor that can easily work in tandem with the CPU, which is the thing that processes like the normal data, the game itself. In other words, you got one processor, it handles the game instructions, and you got a different processor that handles only the graphics. This made the NES faster than other video game systems that were out in 1983, since that graphics processor didn't have to wait for this other thing to finish before it could draw the new graphics. Now, Famicom cartridges looked something like this, but the truth is that most of this space was just empty plastic. So this is the cartridge for the original Donkey Kong, which is one of the first games ever released for the Famicom. If you flip this over, you can clearly see and read the two chips. This one on the left is the CHR, which contains the sprites. It talks directly to that PPU. And this one on the right is called the PRG. This talks directly to the CPU. Now, Donkey Kong is pretty small overall. It takes up a whopping 24 kilobytes of space, which isn't much. But it didn't reach the maximum potential of the Famicom. So even though the Famicom was released way back in 1983, it could handle a pretty large amount of data, especially for its time. So as you know, Super Mario Bros. Was a revolutionary game when it was first released. But what you might not realize is that this game showed off what was essentially the maximum potential of the system at the time. Super Mario Bros. Had a 32 kilobyte PRG and an 8 kilobyte CHR, which was the maximum that the NES hardware could read. And as you can see here, the layout looks a lot like what we saw for Donkey Kong. But there was another thing that the Famicom was capable of. It was also capable of reading an extra sound chip. I'm not sure that I fully understand why this capability was part of the Famicom from the start, but it certainly was there. And in fact, I'll show you the schematics to prove it. The Famicom cartridges used a 60-pin connector to connect directly with the processing chips. This NES Dev Wiki diagram shows all of these pins that communicated directly between the PRG chip and the CPU of the NES. Meanwhile, these pins communicated directly between the CHR chip and the PPU. And then you've got these two pins that allowed for audio input and output. As NES Dev Wiki helpfully explains, these pins actually allowed the cartridges themselves to mix audio with their own audio sources, giving you an expanded audio experience. That's why you hear the familiar bases loaded music mixed together so perfectly with the high quality voices. Now, when you take a look at the inside of the Japanese version of Bases Loaded, you'll think that you're looking at like a mutant cartridge, right? It makes Donkey Kong and Super Mario Bros. Look so quaint and cute. As you can see here, there are no fewer than 6 chips on this bad boy. So you've got your PRG here on the left. Remember, that's the game information. Here on the right is the CHR. And this thing way up here on top is a 256 kilobyte voice synthesizer chip, which is where the extra sound comes from. That 256 kilobyte voice chip actually has more memory than the PRG and the CHR combined, and that's why these sound effects are so crisp. And if you remember right, I skipped 3 other chips that were on the middle of that board, so let's go back and take a look at them. These 3 chips in the middle make what we call the mapper. It's the thing that allows this game to be bigger than the Famicom could normally read. Not counting the sound chip, Bases Loaded is almost 5 times bigger than Super Mario Bros. The mapper, also known as a memory management controller, is basically an engineering trick that allows NES cartridges to use games that are technically too big for the system. Now, it's not too hard to understand in theory how this works, though it's crazy to me that somebody actually thought of this. So basically, those chips use techniques that would point the CPU and the PPU from the NES only at certain parts of the memory chips when they were needed. So the CPU can only read about 32 kilobytes of memory at once, and so the mapper would point the CPU to the right chunk of 32 kilobytes or so at precisely the right time. The PPU, on the other hand, can only read about 8 kilobytes, and so the mapper will point it to the right sprites at the right time. And all of this, of course, happens instantly since it's using ROM chips, not disks, so you don't have to sit there and wait for something to load. In fact, this fixes one of the biggest issues of the Famicom disk system. As cool as Mario was, Nintendo's biggest problem was figuring out how to accommodate games that were always increasing in size. Nintendo came up with stuff like the Famicom Disk System to try to increase the amount of memory that the Famicom could read. To get the disk system to work, you had to stick this freaking huge black box thing into the cartridge slot. That would then allow the machine to communicate with the disk system, which would read from the disk and load information. A disk like this could hold a total of 112 kilobytes, but I believe that it would only hold PRG, or the actual programming data. And the biggest problem with that disk system is that it was just slow. I mean, it was really, really slow. Not only could your disks go bad over time, but you couldn't start up games right away. You had to wait for the loading screens, and we all hate loading screens. So if you play a game like Konami's Exciting Baseball, one of only 2 Famicom Disk System baseball games, you're going to spend a bunch of time waiting for the stupid thing to load. It takes a while to load the initial menu, and then you've got to wait for forever to load the actual game. This includes time spent flipping the disc over from one side to the other, which is really annoying. Because it uses ROM data instead of loading from a disk, you can load bases loaded instantly. There's no loading screen at all. Everything just shows up right when you want it to, which is one of the major benefits of ROM-based technology. And the crazy thing about all of this is that the PRG data on bases loaded, that's the part that has like the game instructions, it's actually larger than the total memory capacity of a single Famicom Disk System disk. That's why this mapper trick is so important, right? It basically extended the life of the Famicom by a decade because it meant that increasingly complex games could still work even though you had this old hardware. Exciting Baseball is an awful game, but Bases Loaded is an all-time classic, and it's all thanks to the mappers. And basically, you can think of the extra sound chip as a kind of extension of that mapper idea. It was a major improvement over the basic audio capabilities of the Famicom and allowed for sound that sounded incredible. The more I play this game, the more that I realize that it's really the sound that made it great, not the visuals. But of course, Nintendo had to come along and ruin this. And Nintendo ruined this because of that stupid lockout chip policy, and it really drives me nuts. You don't need to look at the internals to see that NES cartridges are wider than Famicom cartridges. The cartridges were taller too, though most of the games didn't use up all of that extra space that they theoretically could. The important thing for us to understand though is that the NES included 72 pins here on the bottom as opposed to 60 for the Famicom. Now normally you would think that this would be a great thing, right? I mean 72 pins, that means that there's more ways for the cartridge to interact with the system, right? Except it didn't work out in this case. So let's go back and look at the schematics. Okay, a lot of this is the same as the Famicom except with 2 major differences. So first you've got these 10 pins that are called EXP. These connect to the so-called expansion port. So if you look at the bottom of an original style NES unit and you take off the little piece of plastic, you'll find this 10-pin port. As David Sheff describes in the classic book Game Over, this was originally designed for something like a modem for the NES, and there was almost one that came out in 1991. In the end, though, nothing came out. So people have been able to use this over the years to do all sorts of crazy tricks with the NES. And in theory, back in those days, you could have connected something like a disk drive or even a portable hard drive to the NES while running a game from the cartridge slot, right? Remember, with the Famicom Disk System, you had to plug it in through the cartridge slot. You could only run one or the other. With the NES, since the expansion port is on the bottom, you could plug something in on the bottom and on the top at the same time, right? That could have opened up the memory of the NES to amazing levels. Anyway, remember, even with those 10 pins that are taken up by that useless expansion port, we still have another 62 pins left. So what happened to the extra sound pins? Well, if you look at the schematics again, you will see the answer. There are 4 pins taken up by something called the CIC. Okay, this is what the North American version of the NES looks like on the inside, and it includes a lot of the same stuff that you just saw on the Famicom. This chip on the bottom right, however, this 3193A chip, this is the lockout chip. It looks for a corresponding chip from the cartridge that provides the key. That happens to be the chip located on the left side of the cartridge. And Bases Loaded will only load for you if the 2 chips are able to communicate. So that blinking light that you get on your NES all the time, that's caused by the lockout chips not reading each other properly. That's the copyright system in the NES, and most of the time it's not detecting a bootleg cartridge. Most of the time, including back when I was a kid, it was just failing to read and failing to load because it's not very well thought through technology. You are more likely to experience system failures with the copyright lockout chip as the system ages, which is a big problem. Now, the worst part of all, though, is that the NES is missing those great Famicom sounds. And again, this is all because of that stupid copyright lockout system. I mean, don't get me wrong, back in the day we all thought that the sounds in this game were great. But it's just not the same without that synthesizer. Even something like a dramatic home run just does not feel the same without the roar of the crowd. So believe it or not, Bases Loaded was not the only game that really suffered because of that stupid lockout chip idea. In fact, the game that was hurt the most was none other than Castlevania 3. You probably didn't realize this if you've only played the North American version of the game like most of us, but as soon as you see the Japanese version, or rather as soon as you hear it, you'll realize that there's a problem. I mean, this game is simply an epic no matter how you look at it. The sound, the graphics, the overall vibe of this game, it's second to none. This is seriously one of the best experiences on the NES, and it's one of the best 8-bit games that I've ever played. Now compare that to the Japanese version and you'll be surprised. The music in the Japanese version is even better. While the visuals are pretty much the same, the music does a much better job of setting the overall tone. I mean, this is a soundtrack that rivals the best of the Super Famicom. And when you look at the internals, you can see what's going on. The NES cartridge is the same size as any other game, but there's a lot more going on inside. As you can see, the PCB board is bigger than the other games that we've looked at so far. And it's highlighted by this baby, the MMC5, one of the most advanced mappers available for the NES. There were only a few games that used the MMC5, and most of them are either Japanese games or later releases that came out near the end of the life of the NES. And the game uses quite a bit of memory for an NES game, though I should note that this is not the biggest. But that's really nothing compared to the amazing quality of the Famicom version. This game is called Akumajo Densetsu, Legend of the Demon Castle. The internals look a little bit smaller than the NES release, but this huge chip up here serves two purposes. It is both the mapper chip and the chip that provides that extra sound. This particular chip is used only for this one game, and it is quite versatile. But the NES version of Castlevania 3 was nothing like the original, at least not the audio. Again, the reason is because Nintendo decided long ago that it absolutely had to have that lockout chip on the NES. And it really is a shame when you think about it. Bases Loaded would have been amazing if it had sound like that. We really missed out on something good, and I blame Nintendo. Anyway, there are really only a handful of games that use this extra audio functionality, and most of them are Jaleco sports games. Konami had less than half a dozen games overall that use this technology, and Akumajo Densetsu is really the only one that's worth playing. Namco used it in a few games, but for some reason it never used it for Famista, which really is a shame. The Famicom Disk System could use expanded audio as well, which is why the Japanese version of Zelda sounds better than the NES version. But unfortunately, there weren't many other games out there like this. Anyway, personally, I think the Japanese edition of Bases Loaded is legitimately one of the best Famicom baseball games of all time. The NES version is good, but I have to take off points because it just doesn't have the same immersive sound. Anyway, what do you think? Am I too harsh on the US version of the game? Or do you agree with me that Nintendo really screwed us over? Let me know in the comments.